Let's start with an uncomfortable truth that music historians love to whisper at conferences and shout after a few glasses of wine. The Romantic era did not so much begin as it got shoved into existence by one furious, half-deaf man in Vienna who refused to write a symphony that behaved itself. Every textbook will tell you the classical period ended somewhere around 1820, and the Romantic period picked up the baton. But that's a tidy lie for people who don't want to admit that Ludwig van Beethoven basically bullied an entire century of composers into feeling things very loudly in public. Haydn and Mozart had spent decades perfecting a musical language of balance, proportion, and good manners. Symphonies that resolved like a polite dinner conversation, sonata forms that behaved like a Swiss train schedule, and melodies that never overstayed their welcome. Then Beethoven arrived, looked at all that elegant symmetry, and essentially said, "Cute, now watch this," before writing the Eroica Symphony, a piece so long and so emotionally overwrought that its own dedicatee, Napoleon, got scratched off the title page in a fit of rage that has nothing on the rage of the music itself. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the classical period was actually trying to do, which was, in a word, restraint. Classical composers worked inside forms: sonata allegro, minuet and trio, rondo, the way a sonnet writer works inside 14 lines. Not because they lacked imagination, but because the constraint was the whole point, a kind of intellectual elegance, where the pleasure came from proportion and wit rather than raw feeling. Music in this era served courts, aristocratic patrons, and polite society, and it largely stayed in its emotional lane. Even a stormy Mozart symphony resolves itself with the tidiness of someone apologizing for raising their voice. The Romantic period, by contrast, treated emotional excess not as a flaw to be corrected, but as the entire business plan. Suddenly, composers wanted you to feel heartbreak, nationalism, cosmic dread, unrequited love, and existential longing, sometimes all in the same movement. Forms stretched or dissolved entirely, harmony went chromatic and unstable in ways that made classical ears clutch their pearls. Orchestras ballooned in size, and music started telling stories: program music, tone poems, operas soaked in myth and destiny, instead of simply existing as elegant sound architecture. Composers also stopped thinking of themselves as skilled tradesmen serving a patron, and started thinking of themselves as tortured geniuses serving art itself, capital A. A self-image that Beethoven basically invented through sheer force of personality and questionable hygiene. Which brings us to the real scandal. Beethoven did not live in the Romantic era at all. He died in 1827, comfortably within what any calendar would call the classical period, having spent his childhood being drilled in the styles of Haydn and Mozart by a father who treated him less like a son and more like a get-rich-quick scheme. His early works, the First and Second Symphonies, the early piano sonatas, are gorgeous, competent, and almost embarrassingly well-behaved. The sound of a young composer proving he can play by the rules before he starts breaking them. But somewhere around 1802, standing in a country house in Heiligenstadt and confronting the horrifying realization that his hearing, a composer's entire professional toolkit, was failing him, Beethoven wrote a despairing letter to his brothers, considered the abyss, and then apparently decided the correct response to personal catastrophe was to compose louder. What followed is now called his heroic middle period, and it is where the classical rulebook starts developing suspicious tears down the middle. Symphonies grow to unprecedented lengths, harmonies wander into unresolved tension for entire movements, and the music becomes explicitly about struggle, defiance, and triumph, as though every piece were secretly a diary entry titled, "Take That, Universe!" The Fifth Symphony's famous four-note motif is basically fate knocking on the door, and Beethoven answering by rearranging the furniture, the house, and eventually the entire neighborhood. Then, in his late period, deaf as a post and increasingly indifferent to what anyone thought was fashionable, Beethoven wrote music that Vienna's classical establishment found borderline incomprehensible. The late string quartets, dense with fugue and strange harmonic detours, and the Ninth Symphony, which does something almost sacrilegious for the time. It adds a chorus singing full text to a symphony, a genre that had previously been proudly, stubbornly instrumental. Composers who heard the Ninth's premiere in 1824 walked out not entirely sure whether they'd witnessed a masterpiece or a fire alarm, and honestly, 50 years of confused musicologists would agree with both readings simultaneously. This is why the claim that Beethoven belonged to both periods isn't sentimental nonsense. It's structurally true. His early work is classical vocabulary spoken fluently, his middle work is that vocabulary stretched until the seams groan, and his late work is a foreign language that the next generation would spend decades learning to speak. Schubert, dying tragically young in 1828, worshipped Beethoven from an uncomfortably close proximity in Vienna and absorbed his emotional intensity into song. Berlioz heard the Ninth Symphony and decided the correct professional response was to write a symphony about a man who hallucinates his own execution after a bad breakup, which, credit where due, is an escalation. Liszt built an entire career transcribing and idolizing Beethoven's symphonies. Wagner treated him as a prophet, whose Ninth Symphony basically preordained the existence of opera as total artwork. And Brahms spent so long standing in Beethoven's shadow, trying to write a symphony worthy of him, that it took over 20 years, prompting a conductor to nickname Brahms' own First Symphony Beethoven's 10th, a compliment so backhanded it should have come with a warning label. So, when people say the Romantic era was shaped almost entirely in Beethoven's shadow, they are not exaggerating for dramatic effect. They are describing a documented chain of direct influence, imitation, anxiety, and outright hero worship that runs through nearly every major Romantic composer's biography. The classical period gave music its manners. Beethoven gave it a nervous breakdown, in the best possible sense. And the Romantics spent the rest of the 19th century living inside that breakdown, dressing it up in nationalism, mythology, virtuosity, and increasingly enormous orchestras. He is classical by birth certificate and training, Romantic by temperament and legacy. And the honest academic answer to which era does Beethoven belong to is that he is the door itself, standing exactly on the threshold, deaf, furious, and absolutely refusing to close behind him.